In this video, I would like to introduce you to a tool that you'll probably use pretty frequently if you do any woodworking here in the shop, and that is the miter saw. Now we have two miter saws here in the shop. We have this 10-inch Makita miter saw, and then we have a larger 14-inch sliding compound miter saw in the upper shop. This little one here, we'll look at this one first. It's really good for cutting up smaller pieces of wood for frames, and I also have it down here in the lower shop across from the area where I keep all of the scrap wood, and so you can use this to cut any of that wood to length. You can use this saw to cut older wood and reclaimed wood, but I just ask that before you make a cut, you look very closely at the wood to see if there are any nails or screws. Because if you hit a nail or screw with this saw, you will damage or possibly ruin the blade. And then we have to replace it, and that gets expensive. Now, something else to remember about both of these saws is they do not have an electric braking system like the table saw. So they will cut you. And if one of these saws comes in contact with your finger, it will quickly and efficiently remove it from your hand. Please do not cut yourself with one of these saws. So let's talk about how to operate these saws safely and efficiently, and I'll go over a couple of the simple processes that you might use to utilize this saw in a project. So first things first, if you're going to use this saw or any other tool in the shop, you're probably going to want to wear safety glasses just to protect your eyes. Now, if you already wear glasses, prescription glasses, again, remember, prescription glasses are not safety glasses unless you have specifically asked to have safety lenses put in your prescription glasses. If you have to wear your prescription glasses and they don't have safety lenses, it's best to use a face shield, which is usually hanging around several of the tools in the shop you would want to use. These go on with a little adjustment knob in the back, so you can turn it until it's too big for you, put it on, and then turn that knob to tighten it up. Sometimes you have to pull or push in on that knob to allow it to turn. Don't force it. Then put that down. Now this one's that was really dirty, so you might want to wipe them off. They do collect dust. You may need to wipe or rinse them off. Please, when you're using face shields, if you set them down in the shop, don't set them down like this. That scratches up the surface. Set them down on the table like that. Okay. So I got my safety glasses on. I took off my ring. Nothing to be worried about in terms of safety. I've got my protective apron on. I'm ready to make some cuts. Now, this saw has a safety button, so you have to push that button before you can pull the trigger to the saw. If I don't push that top button, I cannot start up the saw. A lot of people have never used this saw come up and they go, it's broken, and it won't work, right? You have to push that button in. Then it'll start up. Once you push the button in, you can push the saw down to make your cut. Do not start the saw with the blade touching the wood. What you want to do to make a cut is you want to get your board in place, have it all lined up where you want it, have a pencil mark drawn. I will oftentimes make my pencil mark and then bring the blade down to make sure that the blade is on the right side of the cut. Remember, the blade will take 1/8 of an inch, so you want to make sure that your mark is on the side that you're keeping, because the blade's going to take 1/8 inch off of the other side. And then, once you have your board lined up, you will hold it in place, start up the saw, and then make your cut, like this. You want to wait until the blade completely stops moving before you retrieve the cutoff or before you take your workpiece away. Now, this saw has a 5-inch cut. So you can cut any piece of wood or or make any cut that's 5 inches long. For a straight cut, that means a 5-inch board. This board is a little bit longer than 5 inches, and so you can see here that it didn't make it quite all the way through. Now I can do one of two things. I can turn the board around, and I can line up the blade with the cut by just bringing the blade down until it's actually in the groove, and I can finish my cut off. Or I can just go up and use the bigger saw. Probably a safer thing to do to not flip the board over. But sometimes when I'm down here in the lower shop and I'm just trying to cut a piece quick, I might do that, flipping it over. Now, a couple more best practices with making simple straight cuts on this saw. Never, ever cut anything that's not flat. You don't want to cut a piece of round wood. So I have a couple of examples here. This is a spindle from a reclaimed chair. It's got some pretty cool shapes. You may end up wanting to use this in a sculpture or assemblage. It would be tempting to just flop this down on there and cut it wherever you wanted to have it cut. Problem is, there's no flat surface on this. As soon as the blade comes in contact with this, it's going to start to spin it like a roller. And that's very, very dangerous. That can bind up the saw and hurt you, break the saw, and you're not going to get the kind of cut you want. So cutting something like this, it's best to use a hand saw. Now there are some exceptions. Here's another piece of wood. This has a round end to it, but then it has this flat piece. I think this was a piece of a bed. Now, if you wanted to cut this, what you could do is brace the flat edge against the fence. Now you'd want to avoid these pegs, but if I set it down with the pegs up or facing out and it's against the fence, the back fence here, then I could make a cut to the round section of this safely. This saw in the lower shop is hooked into the old vacuum that you see right there, and I mentioned this in an earlier video. When you're doing a lot of cutting down here, please turn that vacuum on. It'll draw dust and chips away from the saw and keep the shop cleaner and also give you a cleaner cut. Now another thing that this saw in the lower shop has is a stop, meaning you can set a stop if you're cutting lots of pieces that are the same size. The work stop on this saw is very simple. Just a knob to tighten and loosen it. It slides back and forth. In fact, it just sits there. It's not even locked in any way. To tighten it, just turn the knob. That'll keep it in place. Then you can put your work up against it. It also has this nice feature that if you need to cut something that's longer than the stop you've set, you can pull that up and a small enough piece of wood will fit under it until you get that trimmed to length. You can put the stop back. So the first thing I would do is measure my first 12-inch section and make a mark. And to do that, I would use my tape measure and a pencil, and then I can use this sliding square. It's called a sliding square because it has a little knob. You can slide it back and forth. It's also called a combo square because it will measure things 90-degree angle and a 45. So this is very useful for mitering and making picture frames and boxes and things like that. So I would make my mark at 10 inches. I would make a longer mark with the sliding square, make sure that I had a nice square mark. Then I would put the mark right up against the blade to make sure that I make my cut right at 12 inches. Then before I make my cut, I'm going to go ahead and set the stop behind the board. That way, the next time I need to make a cut, I don't have to mark the board. I can just put it right up against the stop. This is a great way to save time. If you're cutting a bunch of pieces that are the same size, I really recommend that you utilize the work stop. Now the reason this saw is called a miter saw is because it can do miter cuts A lot of folks use it to make picture frames, and so you'll notice that the blade swivels. So the way to do that is to loosen this handle, and then there's a thumb tab. And once you push that down, you can swivel the blade the direction that you need to get an angle. It will click into place at certain measurements: 15, 22.5, 30, and conveniently 45. These are typical angles used in carpentry. If you want it to be somewhere in between one of those angles, you can set it wherever you need it and then retighten that handle and it'll stay put. Mostly, especially when you first get started, you'll be using the 45-degree angle. So let's do a miter cut and see what that looks like. I've made my pencil mark on the board. Again, I'm going to line it up with the blade and make my cut. To make sure that I got a good 45, again, I can use this. Both of these saws have little marks on the table to show you where not to put your hands. So a good idea is to keep your hands away from the blade. Do not put them anywhere in between those two little marks. This is especially important when you're making a miter cut. Don't ever put your hand back behind the angle of the blade where you cannot see it or where you cannot see your thumb. If you can't see where your hand is, you're in danger of cutting off a finger or thumb. If you should ever find yourself in need of making a cut on a very small piece of wood and you feel like you can't safely hold that wood without getting your fingers too close to the blade, there is this little work holder here. It doesn't work for everything. It doesn't work for very thin wood, and it only gets so close to the blade. But it is there if you want to utilize it. There's a thumb screw to tighten the back so that it doesn't swivel. And then tighten this clamp down until the wood is in place. Remember, the blade is going to push the wood back against the fence. So if it swivels out a little, that's okay, as long as it doesn't move when you push against it. Now we're up in the upper shop, and let's take a look at the bigger of the two miter saws. This is the Bosch 12-inch dual bevel hinge sliding miter saw. It's a mouthful. I usually just call it the sliding miter saw. It's called that because not only does it cut downward like the other saw, like a chop saw, it also pulls across. That gives you a full 12-inch cross cut. Now, to operate this saw, first thing you should know is, again, start the blade while it's up in this position before you start moving it. Then you cut down. Then if you need to, you pull it across. Do not ever cut down and push. That goes the wrong way with the teeth of the blade and you won't get a very good cut. Now there is a lock on this saw, so if you're just cutting something and you're not going to need it to slide, since that can be a funny feeling sometimes, there is a little latch here in the back. I'll show you close up. And you can latch it and then you cannot slide it towards you. Now this is a construction grade saw. It's a really nice one. You can cut used wood on this, but again, I suggest that you look very closely at the wood to make sure that there are no screws or nails before you go cutting. If you hit a nail with this blade, you're going to ruin the blade, and then we'll have to replace it, and that gets expensive, as I said before. This saw blade has a little bit of a different safety switch. Rather than the button on top, first you notice the handle is going the other direction, it's sideways. It has this big lever that you pull or squeeze, but it will not work unless you also push the safety button. This is one that you push with your thumb. So you push it either direction, but this saw is made to operate with your right hand. So I use my thumb, and I usually push it towards the blade with my thumb, and then I squeeze the trigger. Now, the reason this is called a dual or a compound miter saw is because it will do your miter cuts like the other saw, but it also pivots this way. So you can make more complicated cuts, more complicated shapes. Now, to actuate those two movements, first of all, a standard miter has the same sort of gauge on it, and you pull up on this little red lever down here, make sure that the knob is loose, pull up on the lever, and you can swivel it. And again, it will click into place in those common measurement notches. Anything in between there, you'll want to set it just right and then tighten the knob. Now, to get the other angle on the blade, you use this red paddle here. You pull up, it clicks, then the blade is free to move. You set it at the angle you want, and then you lock it again. If you ever make any adjustments on this saw or the saw down in the lower shop, when you're all finished working, or if you're just going to step away from the saw for a few minutes to do something else, put everything back to 0. Make sure that all the angles are returned so that it would make a clean 90-degree cut. And always make sure that everything is locked back in place. I even recommend that you put the latch back in place so that this doesn't slide across on somebody. So let's make a few cuts, and I'll show you what this saw can do. One thing you'll notice about this saw is that it has a roller on either side that's adjustable. I can help you with this the first time you operate the saw because it can be a little complicated, but these rollers are adjustable, and they can be set very wide if you're trying to cut a very large board. Of course, if you're cutting anything that big, you're going to want to work with a partner anyway, so please come and talk to me. Now, I've gotten all set up here to cut this piece of wood, and I know that my cut depth is sufficient, so I'm going to undo the little latch so that I can make my sliding cut. I have my safety glasses on. I'm all set to go. As with most tools in the shop, setup is one of the most important things that you can do to keep yourself safe. Whenever you use either of the miter saws, be sure that the table is clear of tools, especially the area where the blade comes down. Make sure that the wood you're cutting sits snugly against the fence and is flat. Never cut anything round on one of the chop saws. For this saw that has the adjustable rollers for the infeed and outfeed, make sure that they are set so that your workpiece sits flat on the base of the saw table. If they are set so that your workpiece is lifted a little bit, that will cause a gap, and when you cut, your board will shift, and that can cause an accident or can cause you to get not a very clean cut. When you first go to use this saw, please come and talk to me even if you've watched this video, and I'll help you and make sure that you feel safe.